Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the fascinating world of ancient Chinese warfare. So imagine this. In ancient China, war wasn't just about fighting for fun, it was a serious business. Regions fought to become more powerful, expand their territories, and sometimes to overthrow a ruling dynasty. In the early days, around the first millennium BCE, armies had tens of thousands of soldiers. But by the first millennium CE, that number grew into hundreds of thousands. With more soldiers came more advanced technology. Chariots were replaced by cavalry, bows evolved into crossbows, and eventually they even had gunpowder bombs. Now, even though the Chinese scholars and thinkers didn't really like war and looked down on those who fought, it was tough for ordinary people to avoid it. It was either fight or face the risk of being killed, enslaved, or losing everything they had. During the Chinese Bronze Age, city rulers were always competing to grab their neighbors' riches. Winning these battles made them more legitimate and improved their people's welfare. Those who lost had their homes destroyed and were either killed or enslaved. Over time, wars between states became a common part of China's history. But here's the thing, unlike many other ancient societies, China didn't glorify war as much. Thanks to Confucian philosophy, which valued civil life over military achievements, you won't find as many heroic battle stories in Chinese literature and art. Even famous works like Sun Tzu's The Art of War advised against prolonged warfare. Generals and ambitious officers did study military strategies, but from the emperor down, war was often seen as a last resort. The Han Dynasty and some Tang Dynasty emperors did expand their territories, but they usually preferred paying off their neighbors with silver and silk. They also spread their culture as a way to defend China's borders. And if war was unavoidable, they'd rather hire foreign troops to fight for them. The intellectuals weren't the only ones who disapproved of war. Bureaucrats didn't care much for uncultured military men, and the majority of Chinese peasants weren't fans either. They were the ones who had to endure conscription, pay heavy taxes, and have their farms invaded. Despite this general dislike for war, China still had its fair share of conflicts. Fortifications were common during the Bronze Age, and periods like the Autumn and Spring period and the Warring States period were filled with battles. The fall of the Han Dynasty saw constant fighting between rival states, and northern steppe tribes often attacked China's borders. Even Chinese emperors weren't shy about launching attacks on places like ancient Korea. And now, let's talk about the weapons that defined ancient Chinese warfare. The bow was the superstar weapon throughout China's history. Since the Neolithic period, bows were crucial, but it was during the Shang Dynasty that the composite bow made its debut, becoming a powerful part of the army's attack strategy. Archers would start battles with volleys of arrows, protecting the infantry as they advanced or retreated. Archers were also key in chariots and cavalry. One of the most iconic weapons of ancient China was the crossbow. Introduced during the Warring States period, it showcased China's knack for innovation and effective training. The Han Dynasty used crossbows to expand their empire, successfully defending against cavalry units. Crossbowmen usually protected the flanks of infantry units. Over time, crossbows became lighter, easier to use with one hand, and more powerful and accurate. Some artillery versions were even mounted on swivel bases, making them effective for both offense and defense in fortified cities. Swords made a relatively late appearance on Chinese battlefields around 500 BCE. They evolved from long-bladed daggers and spearheads, initially used for stabbing. True swords were first made from bronze and later from iron. During the Han period, advancements in metalworking produced stronger, sharper blades. Other common weapons included halberds, a mix of spear and axe, spears, javelins, daggers, and battle axes. Artillery played a significant role starting from the Han period with stone-throwing catapults. These were mainly used in sieges by both attackers and defenders. The more powerful counterweighted catapult came much later in the 13th century. Artillery fired stones, metal or terracotta missiles, incendiary bombs using naphtha oil, known as Greek fire from the 10th century, and eventually bombs using gunpowder during the Sung dynasty. The earliest reference to gunpowder dates back to 1044 CE, and a silk banner from the 9th century, if accurately dated, mentions its use. Gunpowder weapons in ancient China were mostly used to start fires with soft casings made of bamboo or paper. The true fragmentation bomb appeared in the 13th century. As weapons became more lethal, so did the need for better protection. Early armor was quite impressive visually, like tiger skins, but not very effective. By the Shang dynasty, warriors began using hardened leather to protect their chest and back. The Zhou dynasty saw the development of more flexible armor tunics made from rectangles of tanned and lacquered leather or bronze linked together with hemp or rivets. You can see examples of this type in the Qin warriors of the Terracotta Army from the 3rd century BCE. From the Han period onward, iron became more commonly used in armor. Shields also evolved, initially made from bamboo or leather, but later incorporating metal elements. Helmets followed a similar path, evolving to protect the ears and neck, and sometimes decorated with plumes, engravings, and precious metals or ivory. Specialized armor was also developed. Warriors in chariots who didn't need to move as much wore full-length armored coats. Heavy cavalry had protection for both the rider and the horse's legs. And now let's delve into the use of chariots and cavalry. Chariots first appeared around 1250 BCE and saw their peak between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE. Initially, they were status symbols for commanders, but soon became vital shock weapons on the battlefield. Typically, a chariot carried a rider, a bowman, and a spearman, often deployed in groups of 5. Pulled by 2, 3, or 4 horses, these chariots came in various forms: light and fast ones for moving troops, heavy armored versions for breaking enemy lines, and some even had fixed heavy crossbows or towers for better battlefield visibility. Chariot corps were also effective in pursuing retreating armies. However, they needed wide, flat areas to operate, which eventually led to their replacement by cavalry around the 4th century BCE. Cavalry was likely inspired by northern steppe tribes, offering greater speed and mobility than chariots. The challenge was mastering the skills of riding and using weapons from horseback, especially before the invention of the saddle and stirrup. It wasn't until the Han period that cavalry became a significant part of Chinese armies. Cavalry riders wielded bows, lances, swords, or halberds, and were used to protect infantry flanks, serve as shock troops, and conduct hit-and-run raids on enemies. And now, let's talk about fortifications. Surrounding settlements with protective ditches dates back to the 7th century BCE, while building fortification walls from dried earth goes back to the late Neolithic period. However, siege warfare didn't become common until the Zhou dynasty, when conflicts aimed at total destruction of the enemy rather than just defeating their army. By the Han period, city walls were typically raised to about 6 meters and made from compacted earth. These walls often featured crenellations, towers, and monumental gates for enhanced defense. To make walls more durable, especially against attacks using water to undermine them, the lower parts were sometimes covered in stone. Pottery shards, plant material, branches, and sand were mixed with the earth to strengthen the walls. Wide ditches, often filled with water, and sometimes a double ring of walls, were also employed to protect cities long enough for reinforcements to arrive. State frontiers were fortified with high walls and watchtowers. This practice began in the north around the 8th century BCE and became widespread during the Warring States period when various powerful states vied for control of China. Most of these structures were dismantled by the Qin dynasty, but one wall was expanded to become the Great Wall of China. Extended further by later dynasties, the Great Wall eventually stretched about 5,000 kilometers, helping to protect China's northern frontier from nomadic steppe tribes for centuries. And now let's how their armies were organized and the strategies they used. China's long history saw many changes in warfare practices and innovations with each dynasty. Officers were usually professionals, often inheriting their positions. Ordinary troops were mostly conscripts or captured soldiers, and even convicts could be pressed into service. There were also volunteers, typically young men from noble families who joined as cavalrymen seeking adventure and glory. Armies were traditionally divided into 3 divisions, but by the Warring States period, a typical army was organized into 5 divisions, each with a flag representing its function. The red bird represented the vanguard, the green dragon the left wing, the white tiger the right wing, the black tortoise the rear guard, and the great bear constellation the commander and his bodyguard. With the rise of the crossbow, troops skilled in its use often formed elite corps, while other specific units served as shock troops to bolster the army where needed or to confuse the enemy. Archers and cavalry typically protected the flanks of heavier infantry, and chariots, when used, could fulfill similar roles or cover the rear. These positions, described as ideals in military treatises, are confirmed by the terracotta army of Shi Huangti. To better organize troops and execute the commander's strategies, flags, unit banners, drums, and bells were used on the battlefield. Supporting the soldiers were dedicated officers responsible for logistics, ensuring the army had enough food, water, firewood, fodder, equipment, and shelter. Supplies were transported by river when possible, or by ox carts, horses, and even wheelbarrows from the Han period onward. From the Warring States period, and especially during the Han period, parts of the army were tasked with farming to acquire necessary provisions that couldn't be obtained through foraging, confiscation, or capture. Garrisons with their own food production and improvements in supply roads and canals also extended the duration an army could remain effective in the field. Chinese warfare involved full-on infantry battles, cavalry skirmishes, reconnaissance, espionage, subterfuge, and ambushes. While gentlemanly etiquette in war was emphasized during the Shang and Zhou periods, it was likely an invention of later writers or an exaggeration. By the 4th century BCE, when warfare became more mobile and the stakes higher, commanders were expected to win by any means necessary. An interesting aspect of Chinese warfare was the reliance on expert diviners who studied omens, observed celestial movements, interpreted natural phenomena, and consulted calendars to determine the most auspicious time and place for battle. Without these considerations, it was believed that even the best weapons, men, and tactics would not guarantee victory.